life, are there not times where the Christian life can be extremely things happening that really are just so thrilling? Now, of course, now if we were to sort of be talking about that, we would, when's a time like that? Oh, a time of revival. Well, we've not seen that, have we? But we would say you read history and you can see how thrilling and exciting it must have been in days, and it must be in days like that. But thinking more on a personal level, times of excitement for you in the Christian life. You read the life of Paul in the Acts of the Apostles, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, it really does make for thrilling reading, doesn't it? As you read through, this action after action after action. Imagine living it. Imagine daily living through alongside Paul, being one of his companions and sometimes being hurtled into the sea and so forth, not knowing what's going to happen next. Daily, you would say, your faith was stretched indeed. Imagine Paul tells us of the need to die to self, and is that easy? Do we find that? We can find it easy to talk about, but in the kind of situations, the afflictions, the persecutions that Paul and his companions were facing again and again and again, where you've got to really, in order to live for Christ, you've got to really die to self, not just keeping a quiet, closing your lips at work when someone says something irreverent or whatever. And coming before the Lord and saying, your will be done. Might be easy in times when we're in the quiet waters of life. When daily, you're filled with the kind of stresses. You're being stretched in the way Paul and his companions are. Not so easy then, is it? Not so easy. Let's just give an example of this. If you turn with me to 2 Corinthians chapter 11, well-known verses. And in a sense, you can go from the beginning with it, but we'll go from verse 25, 24 even. He says, 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. He's been flogged, he's been thrown into prison before then. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. By the way, this is before the passage we've just read took place. All this is talking before where we are in Acts, long before. Remember, this letter was written when Paul was still, even before he'd gone to Jerusalem and was arrested there. So all these things took place before that. So we can say he at least was shipwrecked 4 times. Where are we? I've lost where I am now. I'll have to go. Verse 26. Yeah, I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my own countrymen, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, in danger from false brothers. I've labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I've known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I've been cold and naked. Besides everything else, here we go, I face daily the pressure of my concern, which will of course lead to prayer, for all the churches. Who is weak? And I do not feel weak. Who is led into sin? And I do not inwardly burn. And he goes on. I mean, we could read to the end there, but I want you know the situation, the kind of, let's just say Paul was in peril, in danger, constantly, continually throughout his ministry for the Lord Jesus Christ. Daily, he was experiencing these things, but on top of that, daily, he was seeking and seeing the Lord's leading and guiding. His faith was stretched again and again, but it was a growing faith, wasn't it? Always a growing faith, because he found that no matter what the situation, the Lord was with him. Didn't mean to say he would sail through it and not have his hair singed or anything like that, not at all. But the Lord was with him in the trial, and the Lord was watching over him. And more often than not, the Lord would bring him through to the great glory of his name. Say he more often than not, he would bring him through, but Paul was imprisoned, wasn't he? He was not brought through there. But even in those situations where faith is stretched, so you're a Christian and you say God is faithful, now you're in this dungeon. How's that a faithful God? But in that, he knew that the hand of the Lord was still on him, still on him. And he was able to trust that the Lord was controlling these events and using it for his glory. But here in this reading, as before the journey begins, in a sense, chapter 26, it's not all risk, it's not all peril, because for more than 2 years now, he's been able to rest, hasn't he? Kind of under a house arrest, in a sense. But his companions have been able to come to him and so forth. He's been able to write. He's been able to carry on, in a sense. He's been free from danger, from the kind of dangers that we've just read about, and the dangers that we read about before then, that took place after the chapter 27. He's been free of those things. And what would he say? What would he encourage us when you have those times where you're free from kind of the busyness of the Christian life? What an opportunity that gives you to fellowship with the Lord. And I think one of the challenges for Christians today is, I know we live busy lives and so forth, but when we've asked this before, is all the busyness that we're involved in actually necessary? That's one challenge. But then the other one is, of course, even though we might say we're in busy time, there are still times where we have rest. And sometimes we need to just rest and put our feet up, but always, Paul would use these 2 years for developing his fellowship, seeking the Lord, always seeking to build his relationship with the Lord. And that's what we must do. Because, of course, in those times, if you just, sag, as it were, and not do anything, not seek to cultivate your spiritual life, your spiritual muscles grow weak. And the next challenge that comes along, you're not going to be ready for it, are you? Whereas if you seek to grow your spiritual muscles in a day of relative ease, here for Paul, then you're preparing for tomorrow. And there's a day of thunder. And there's a day when your faith is going to be challenged again. And that growing your faith in the good times, so to speak, will bring an opportunity for your faith to shine forth to the glory of the Lord in the next challenge. For 2 years, after 2 years, Paul appeals to Rome. You might ask the question, I hope you remember from what you've looked at, what we've looked at, what you've read before, what you understand of this, but we might ask the question, why does he appeal to Rome? Was it boredom? Was he bored of being sort of under this kind of house arrest? Was he looking for something to happen? Was he trying to, get the situation to move faster? The consequences of it are that it seems as a leap into the unknown. Paul goes back into peril, back into danger. Yeah, I want to say to you, those 2 years, he would have strengthened his faith. He would be fortified by the truth. And he would know that whatever's happening to him on this voyage, he's under the care and the direction of the one of whom he said that this. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, for the good of those who love him. Paul wrote that to the church at Rome before this took place. He didn't just write it because, like thinking of the hymns, what rhymes with last and so forth. He didn't just write it because, let's say something that would be nice and comforting or whatever. He wrote what he meant. He wrote what he had experienced, and he himself knew that in all things, a man who'd been in perils and dangers often, he knew that in all things God was working. Even though he didn't come through it unscathed each time, he knew that God was working it for good. And he loved him. Paul loved the Lord. And he could say, therefore, that God works all things together for good for those who love the Lord. On top of that, when a situation such as what we read in these verses comes to pass, when such a thing as an event takes place, it's another opportunity for faith. It's faith's opportunity. And taking that text, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Paul and we in our situation can take a leap, what we might call a leap of faith. A leap of faith into, yes, for us, the unknown, but for us ultimately knowing that the Lord is with us. In verse 32 of chapter 26, Agrippa says to Festus, this man could have been set free if he'd not appealed to Caesar. So you sort of read that and you being forgetful, we say, oh, Paul, why were you so rash? Why were you so rash in making that appeal to Caesar? But Paul was sure of what he was doing. And now, in taking another leap of faith, as it were now, because he's got to go by faith to Rome, another leap of faith into the unknown, we can say that if you believe, if by faith you believe, for you, this is the way, walk in it. This is the way the Lord would have you to go. And even in taking that step, you err. Wasn't the way that you should have gone. If you're seeking to do it for the glory of the Lord, you can be sure that when you take a leap of faith underneath the everlasting arm, so Paul, he had not said, if you only do not appeal to Rome, everything would have been all right. But in that rash statement, if it were, but we see and we know it wasn't, but in that rash statement, Paul, now you've got to leap into the unknown. But he knows that even if he's erred, underneath are the everlasting arms. And he will direct your path. And what we see here, what I want us to see is actually Paul hasn't made any kind of mistake in this. But in the midst of danger, if doubt should creep in, the Lord is there to reassure. And the Lord reassures Paul. And Paul, therefore, can assure others, as we read. And I want us to see that in these verses. And what I want to do is compare it, if I may, compare it with a situation in my own life and show that what takes place with Paul and applies to Paul actually takes place in the ordinary Christian's life and applies to an ordinary Christian like me. So first of all, Paul could have been set free. That's what we read in verse 32. Paul could have been set free. This man could have been set free if he'd not appealed to Caesar. Now, if you've forgotten what took place before and how it was that Paul made that appeal, you can read that, and I've done it. I've been reading through the chapter, and, I'm talking over years of reading it. You come to that, and you almost feel Paul, you made the wrong choice there. If only you'd not appealed, you could have been set free. You kind of follow along with Agrippa. You get taken up with the text and you follow along. Why did he say that? If only. But you see, it reminds us, doesn't it? We're so forgetful. We're so forgetful of what we've read, of what we've been taught, of what we've understood. Paul appealed because he was cornered. He was cornered before. We'll come to that. Come to my situation. I was cornered. I received a call from the Granary church. And in receiving that call, the path wasn't certain. It wasn't certain. There was no livelihood. There was no means of support for my family. How are we going to, get money and all the rest of it? How are we going to provide? Nothing was in place. I worked for, many of you know this, that I worked for UCB, United Christian Broadcasters. And I was open with them about my situation. I had been for some time. And they knew that I'd had this sense of a call. And now I was able to tell them I'd received one. And the question was really, should I leave or should I stay? Now, they weren't really privy to that kind of thought. I was more or less telling them that I'd accepted the call. But there was no provision, so it wouldn't necessarily happen. Now, you might say, it's unwise. That was unwise to tell them. Until the Lord opened the door, you should have kept quiet. But the relationship I had with them, they'd been good and fair to me. And I believed that it was right to reciprocate that. And not only that, there was a changing role at the company, that there was something else they wanted me to do. Was I up for it? And they were going to put resources and energy into that. And it didn't seem right for me to sort of say, oh, yes, but knowing that I might only be there for a few weeks and so forth. So they knew what was going on. And they needed to know my decision. Was I staying or was I going? Festus was not so kind. He pressed Paul for a decision. If you go to chapter 25 and verse 9, he pressed Paul for a decision. Remember, he said, are you willing to go up to Jerusalem and stand trial before me there on these charges? Now, remember the background. Jews were waiting to kill him. Paul didn't necessarily know that, but he knew that they'd tried to do that before. And so he had every reason to believe that was going to happen again. So he's cornered here. He's cornered to make a decision. The last time the Jews, he was going to go to Jerusalem, the Jews were waiting to kill him on the way. Would that have changed? Probably not. He probably could rightly conclude, of course it hasn't changed. In my situation, I decided it was time for me to take a leap, take that leap of faith I'm talking about. But I sought to do so with a rope attached, a rope attached to me in case. And so, if you can follow me, I said, I'll give you 6 weeks' notice. I'll leave at the end of August. I only had to give a month, but I'll leave at the end of August. I'll give you 6 week notice. But if the doors don't open, if there's nowhere for me to live down south, if there's no income for me down south, then I'll leap, if I may, with a rope to help me lower myself to the ground in case that doesn't happen. Giving me time up north to find an alternative. And so what I put to them was, I handed my notice for the end of August. But if things don't work out for me, may I stay until the end of September? That would give me a month to try and find something else. A little bit of a rope, as I say, to lower me to the ground if it doesn't work. Paul's decision is less complicated. He simply appeals to Caesar, doesn't he? I won't go back to it now, but you read that in verse 10 of chapter 25. I appeal to Caesar. And then Festus says, well, to Caesar you will go, and so forth. And it's times like that when, for us, for me, in my situation, you feel like you're standing on a cliff top, and you've got to make a decision. Why at a cliff top? Well, because when you decide to yes, and you decide to go for it, it feels like you're leaping from the land of safety into the air of uncertainty. And all people in time, in their life, all people take leaps. But for the Christian, I want to get across to us all is it's a leap of faith. We prefer to use the term a step of faith. And a step of faith brings a little bit more comfort, doesn't it? Brings a little bit more assurance. So, brother, you're going to take a step of faith. Yes, I am. Yes, I am. I'm going to take a step of faith. But when you're in the process of taking that step of faith, it doesn't feel like one small step for man. It feels like a giant leap for mankind off the edge of the cliff and into the abyss, because you don't know the outcome. You're just not keeping those crossed. You're keeping these, as it were, and you're saying, Lord, please undertake for me. But you do so with these comforting thoughts that underneath are the everlasting arms, and that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. So we take that leap, don't we? We take that step. trusting that he has hold of our lives. And that is something we really need to keep hold of when we are called to make faith decision. And someone else calls it just a step. But you know it feels like more than a step. It feels like that giant leap, that giant leap. Those two verses, there are many others, but those two verses were the ones that were put to me, as it were, in preparing this. Underneath are the everlasting arms. Yes, it is a leap, but there's arms underneath that are everlasting. They will be there to catch you. They will be there to lower you to the ground. It might be a thrilling ride of great speed, like someone going free fall out of an aeroplane for some time, and you don't know what's going to happen and how the land's going to be. But underneath are the everlasting arms. He will lower you to the ground ultimately. Or even if it feels that you are free falling, no, his arms are underneath to catch you on. Paul could have been set free, but then we come to this second part, the peril at sea. And this is the only bit really well, it's not the only bit because we'll come to another verse later on. But when you look there, you see in verse 2 how they board the ship, they set sail, and the next day they land at a place in verse 3, and Paul is given some freedom to go and see his friends. And then in verse 4, they're out to sea again. They pass by Cyprus and so on. They sail across the open sea off Cilicia, Pamphylia, and so forth. And again, these different places and stages of the journey are mentioned. And you read on, and actually as you read on even further into the rest of the voyage and on to Rome, the one thing, well, it's not the one thing, but one thing that is noticeable again and again, I don't know if you picked it, but it's the attention to detail. The attention to detail. And of course, it's Luke who's writing it. And if you think how Luke, we looked at this at Christmas time, mentioned that twice now, Christmas time, but we looked at it at Christmas time. Luke, in the opening of his gospel, he tells Theophilus how he's carefully investigated. And I remember at the time, sort of speaking about being a detective. He's been a detective to really check these things out, to look into the details, to gather all the evidence, to make a case that, were it to stand in a court of law, the jury would say, it's true, and not just a kind of, we possibly, absolute unanimous. It's true. Careful investigation, detective to get to the truth. But remember, Luke is not writing as some kind of doubter. Well, I don't know about all this. Let me find out about this. There was a man who wrote a book in the late 60s, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I've forgotten his name. Evidence That Demands a Verdict. He was a college student. He was being accosted by these Christians, as it were, telling him about the Lord, and I'm not having any of this. And he set out to disprove the Bible. And so he started to read it. And as he read it more and more, he became more and more convinced. It's true. It's true. And as he looked through and saw more and more evidence, in the end, he ended up on his knees. He ended up crying out to the Lord. He ended up a Christian. And he wrote the book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Demands a verdict. If you read it, he demands a verdict from you. Not take him up, but he was a doubter. Look, he was writing, or not writing as a doubter, but he was investigating as a doubter, not Luke. Not Luke. Then I'm reminded of, you've heard the story of the Whitfield on the table. Heard the story of Whitfield on the table? It wasn't actually Whitfield. It was an impersonator. It was in a public house. And this man, they were all been drinking, and his friend said, do Whitfield, because he had a way in which he could mimic the voice of George Whitfield and so forth, and maybe the gesticulations. I'm quite army, aren't I? I don't know if Whitfield was an army person in that sense, but he jumped up on the table, bar table, they cleared the drinks, he jumped off the table, and he started to harangue them, to preach to them and so forth. Ah, ha, ha. They're laughing their heads off, until suddenly his whole complexion changed and his voice took on a different air and authority, and there was a meaning and purpose to what he was saying, because as he was speaking, he was becoming more and more convicted and more convinced the things that were coming out of his mouth was truth. And when he got down off the table at the end, he'd been converted. Incredible, isn't it? Remarkable. Absolutely remarkable. You see what happens in days of revival. But there was a man, he wasn't just a doubter, he was a mocker. He was a mocker, and God had mercy on him. But here, Luke is neither a doubter nor a mocker. He's certain of the truth. And what he's doing here is he's seeking to bring this evidence with such clarity and such scope, as it were, such detail, so that anyone reading it can be assured that this really took place. This really took place. He seeks to bring us to a greater understanding and ultimately a greater assurance of the truth of God's word that we can assure others. Here, let me put it again, here, he's involved, sorry, Luke himself is involved. In the account in Luke's gospel, he's not involved, is he? He's investigating, but here he's involved. And therefore, the detail is detail that he can readily recount because he was involved in it. He could have said it was a difficult voyage, but we got there. But then he would miss this double opportunity that I'm trying to point out, that he would miss the opportunity to show the accuracy, the meticulous details, so that you and I come to that one conclusion. It's true. It's true. It really took place. But on top of that, I think he's a great writer, and he's highlighting the tension, but not simply so that, wow, a good story, so that we can kind of feel that tension. We can feel the terror of it, as it were. You're in peril at sea. What now? What now? What's going to happen next? This is faith's opportunity. He highlights the tension of the situation, so that in our own life, when we come to a time, a place where we feel we're in peril, we're in danger, we can graphically remember. The Apostle Paul's been there before. The Apostle Paul was in peril at sea. He wasn't alone. He wasn't forsaken. Like imagine someone being abandoned on an island somewhere, all alone. And it's not a golden shore one in the Pacific and so forth. It's one that's, you don't want to be there. But imagine that, being abandoned on an island, but then finding evidence that others had been there before you. Ask yourself, where are they now? Where are they now? You see, there's no bone. No bone. Comfort. Saying comfort. They were rescued. They were rescued. There's no bones there. They were rescued. I shall be too. All this is written to show us that whatever perils and dangers we go through, just as the Lord was with Paul, so shall he be with us. Just as he comforted Paul, so shall he comfort us. That verse in Isaiah 40, verse 4 this morning, actually it was the first verse, wasn't it? 40, verse 1. Comfort my people, says the Lord. Comfort. The Lord Jesus Christ is a good shepherd to provide the comfort that we need when we need it. And thirdly, reassured. In verse 20, we read these words. When neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and the storm continued raging, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. You know, believers, we're so forgetful. Paul was cornered when he made his decision, as it were, and now he's in peril at sea. And so we can sort of look over that and say, oh dear, Paul, that wasn't the right decision to make. It wasn't the right call to say, to make this appeal to Rome. That wasn't the right thing to do. And then you read at the end of verse 20 there, we finally gave up all hope of being saved. You could say, oh, Paul, what have you done? What have you done? Given up all hope of being saved. Luke writes that just as the attention to detail of we went to this place and that place so that you see that the account is true. He was there, he saw it, they really did these things. When he says we gave up all hope of being saved, he really means it. He really means it. Not like we say it. He really means it. They really thought that was the end. He really thought that. Didn't they know? Didn't they know that the Lord had spoken to Paul before? Didn't they know that Paul must go to Rome? They did. They did. But in the midst of danger and peril, they forgot. They forgot. And after days of weariness and without sleep and without food and all these, the windswept seas and so forth, and man overboard perhaps, these kind of things. I know later on we're told that not one of them will be lost, but let me just add to the height, the tension of it. All these different things. You can see in tiredness how easily, how hard it is to hold on to what you know to be true, to what the Lord has promised, to what the Lord has said in his word. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Underneath are the everlasting arms. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. How that just flies away so quickly. We gave up all hope of being saved. Back to UCB. After 2 weeks of giving my notice in, there was a place to live. As many of you know, it was the Mansett Hall, and we could come and stay there. And there was a possibility there might be some kind of income, because there was an organization called Mission for Christ who are looking to employ someone and might like to link that with them working in a church and so forth. But that was something that needed to be explored. There might be an income. And with that in mind, I had a holiday booked to go to Wiltshire. And then UCB, before that happened, said, actually, we want you to jump without a rope. We don't want you to stay. And not they didn't like me, but they wanted to sort of sort things out properly. We don't want you to, you're either leaving at the end of August or you're staying. What's your decision? It was faith's opportunity, wasn't it? Faith's opportunity. So I took a leap of faith and I said, I'm going at the end of August, even though I didn't know that the path wasn't clear and so forth. Of course, young then. Not as young as you are now, but there we are. I was young, felt young. But when you're young, it's exciting. It's exciting. I suppose, I don't know, I've never fancied the idea of hang gliding, but I imagine those who like doing things like that, what a thrill to hang glide. But as you get older, and you've got, I mean, I had family, but they were young and we were careless, but we were just trusting in the Lord, really. But as you get older, these things, it becomes responsibilities. It becomes harder. It's not so easy. It becomes a bit more scary. But whether you feel fear or not, when it's time to leave, you can leave knowing that underneath are the everlasting arms, that the Lord will provide. The Lord provides to those who commit their way to him. If we're prayerful about these things, seeking his will, seeking his face, and committing our way to him, we can be sure he'll direct our paths. And so I agreed to leave, and then I tried to push on a door, which is to mix metaphors, because I'm in the air at the moment, aren't I? But I'm pushing a door as I'm going through the air. Mission for Christ, Mission for Christ. And the door began to open. The man who was in charge of Mission for Christ at that time actually lived, or once lived, not far from where we were going to holiday in Wiltshire. He'd come and meet me there. He knew the very place we were staying. He would come and meet me. But for Paul now, it's not so easy, is it? Paul's is a life and death situation. We gave up all hope of being saved. What happens then? What happens then? When you truly need him most, the Lord comes. The Lord assures, or we can say in this case, reassures. And with that assurance that is given to us, all here, and us too, we're able to reassure others. In verse 24, you read, how the Lord came to him and said, "Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you." You say, now he knows he's going to make it to Rome. But he knew that all along, didn't he? Come on. Head work. Remember these things. Remember the truth. He knew that all along. Right back in chapter 19, when he was in Ephesus, the Lord, Paul, it said, had decided to go to Jerusalem. And after that, he was going to go to Rome. Now, did Paul do these things lightly? Did he wake up one morning and think, you know what, I think I'll go there? He sought the Lord always, what we were saying before. He was constantly in prayer. Constantly in prayer. We might use a phrase today that the Lord laid it on my heart. The Lord laid it on his heart that Jerusalem and then Rome. And that was confirmed to him in Jerusalem that he was going to Rome. Remember chapter 23 and verse 11? Paul's been arrested, but the following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage. As you've testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." Paul knew that all along. 2 years later, 2 years in sort of house arrest captivity, he's cornered, but Paul saw that as the Lord's opening. The Lord's told me I must go to Rome. Here's an opportunity. Will you go to Jerusalem and stand trial there? On the way, they're waiting to kill you, by the way. Festus didn't say that, but Paul knew that. Right, well, there it is. That's the opportunity I've been waiting for. The Lord's told me I'm going to Rome. A door hasn't opened of itself. Now I'm given the opportunity to push on that door. I appeal to Caesar. To Caesar you must go. The door to Rome has opened for Paul. He must go to Rome, and now he's going. Faith takes that opportunity. Faith takes that leap. And not only that, but Festus might well have said, well, very well then, an estate will pay your travel. How about that? We saw that at the time. And so why now does he need reassuring? Why does he need reassuring? Why does the Lord need to come to him at night and say this? And I think that's, I don't know, it for Paul's comfort. Can I go that far? He's only a man, but he was an apostle. I think he's there for us. I think he's there for us because we forget so easy. Even the things that we've been told. Paul was told he would go to Rome. Had Paul forgotten? Was Paul weary like the others? And had he given up all hope of being saved? Does Luke include Paul in that when he says that? It's a difficult one I don't want to cross into to say yes, because Paul was an apostle. Doesn't mean to say he was faultless or anything. But nevertheless, whether he was one who'd given up all hope or not, it's there to reassure and to reassure us who do forget so easily. In peril at sea, in the midst of peril at sea, attacked on all sides, needing the comfort of the Lord. The Lord comes and brings that comfort, brings that reassurance. He gives it, doesn't he? For me, not to compare myself to Paul, I wasn't in any peril. It's just, I bring it to show, here's an ordinary Christian. Here's an ordinary Christian. The Lord will supply. The Lord will supply. As he did for me. The meeting in Whitstable ended with a handshake. Income would be there. Income would be there. A salary would be waiting for me. What did I say? Whitstable. My notes. we started off we went for, let's go for a walk. And we walked all along the south coast and ended up in Whitstable. No, we didn't. And then we got a train back. No, we didn't. The meeting in Wiltshire ended with a handshake. Was I on a cliff top? Not really, as I said before. It felt like one. It felt like one. It seemed like it. But faith's leaps with the everlasting arms underneath. And really, faith can only leap when it remembers that we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him. Paul is reassured. Now Paul can assure the believers who've given up all hope of being saved. We can say for the rest of them, that's certainly the case. He can reassure them, but also he can reassure the non-Christian, the non-believers. And he does that, doesn't he? Look in verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete," and so forth. Verse 22. "But now I urge you, keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." And he speaks about the angel of the Lord coming and reassuring him that none of them will be lost. None of them will be lost. And so he's assured, he's able to assure others. Verse 25, "So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me." And so if you're here or on there as a young Christian, starting out with the Lord, you're never alone. You're never alone. When it comes to making changes in your life, when it comes to making decisions in the Christian life, you feel like you're on the cliff top of anticipation. But actually, it's merely a stepping stone, because underneath are the everlasting arms. Because we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. If you're an older Christian, you can look back, can't you? You can look back and see the hand of the Lord leading your steps, guiding you. As you jumped, you found it's true. Underneath, there are everlasting arms. And they're able to hold me up. They're able to lower me down better than that rope that he was on about before, which you burn your hands on and so forth. Therefore, I can say to myself, older Christian or younger Christian, for the future, keep trusting, because the Lord who held you in the past will hold you in the future. Just like Hudson Taylor, you know, when that prayer was answered and he was given his wages, as it were, how did the chapter end? It ended with him saying, "I've often recalled that situation in times of," he says that word, but in times of peril, in times of danger. "I've often turned to it, and it's been a source of encouragement to me." That's so, isn't it? We say, count your blessing, but we should also say, remember your past blessing. Remember the past experiences of those everlasting arms being underneath. Remember the times when, now you're old, you were never forsaken then, and you won't be forsaken. Remember how you've seen that he works all things together for good. And trust and obey and follow him. Use your own experience to assure others. When they're in peril, and when you're in peril. And yet for all, it ends, doesn't it? For all living by faith, as one door closes, another one opens. For Paul, it's not so easy. My situation was easy. But what he did for Paul, he did for me. What he did for Paul, for me, he does for you, doesn't he? He does for all of us. Look at verse 26. "Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. One leap of faith ends, so another begins." As one adventure ends in the Christian life, so another one begins. You can call it, well, you can say, what's going to happen next? We must run aground on some island. Oh, the uncertainty. But there's no uncertainty with the Lord. No uncertainty. One opportunity ends, so another one begins. We call it faith's opportunity. Amen.